The survey vessel Threnody of Vale dropped out of fold space at the edge of a yellow star's third orbit, and the first thing its crew noticed was that the planet should not have been there. Not the planet itself. Planets were common, dull, predictable, the loose change of a universe the Empire had been counting for 4,000 years. What unsettled the bridge was the silence around it. Every inhabited world the Empire had ever catalogued, across all those centuries of swallowing stars, sang. They broadcast. They leaked. They poured the ceaseless electromagnetic noise of any species clever enough to build a fire and foolish enough to keep building after that, until their own little sky was thick with their chatter, and a fleet could hear them coming from a dozen systems away. That was how the Empire found its meals. It listened for the singing, and it followed the song, and at the end of the song there was always a world full of something that could be taken. This world did not sing. It hung in the dark, blue and white and impossibly quiet, like a stone dropped into a pond a very long time ago, the ripples long since gone still. Fleet Leader Senna Valey stood at the observation rail and felt something for which she had no word. She had read 1,000 worlds in her career. She was a reader, which in the Empire meant something specific and prestigious. She was the one they sent ahead, the one who could look at the bones of a dead civilization and tell you what it had been, what it had known, what it was worth. She had found the ice cities of Orun, frozen in their final hour, and she had walked the floating colonies of the Hesh and read the last words they had carved into their failing hulls. She had stood inside more graveyards than any living member of the Concordant Throne, and she had never once been afraid of a planet. She was afraid now, and she could not have told you why. It was nothing she could point to. The returns were beautiful. The instruments were calm. There was no threat indicator anywhere on the board, no energy signature, no fleet, no fortress, nothing at all but a garden world turning slowly in the light of its yellow sun. And yet the back of her skull had gone cold, the way it went cold in the deep parts of a ruin when some animal older than her intellect noticed a thing her intellect had not caught up to yet. Composition, she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. Beneath her, the analyst, a young man named Koro, who had not yet learned that the universe owed him nothing and was not in any hurry to teach him, scrolled through the returns with the easy hunger of someone who could already smell a promotion. Liquid water oceans, he said, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, surface temperature dead center in the tolerance band, magnetic field intact. Reader, it's a garden world, a perfect one. He looked up, grinning. And it's empty. No traffic, no comms, no orbital infrastructure, nothing. It's just sitting here. It's not empty. Sensors say. I don't care what the sensors say. She did not raise her voice. She never had to. The bridge quieted around her words the way water quiets around a stone. Something built those. She lifted her hand, and the magnification crawled obediently down through the cloud layer, and there they were. Structures, cities, or the ghosts of cities, gray geometric scars spread across the continents like the bones of some enormous animal that had lain down a long time ago and never gotten up again. Roads, threading between them in patient lines. Bridges, flung across rivers by a hand that had wanted to argue with geography and won. The unmistakable rectilinear arrogance of a thinking species that had decided, at some point in its history, that the land would bend to its will rather than the other way around. But nothing moved. No lights crawled across the night side as the planet turned. No heat bloomed where heat should be. The instruments swept the cities and found them cold, every one of them cold as the dark between stars and silent and still. They were not cities. They were the places cities had been. They were tombs, and they had been tombs for a very long time. A dead civilization, Koro breathed, and the grin was gone now, replaced by something harder and more naked. A dead civilization meant artifacts. Artifacts meant technology. Technology meant promotion and wealth and the warm regard of the throne. and the empire bred that particular hunger into all its servants the way other empires bred loyalty or courage. Reader, do you have any idea what this is worth? Senna did not answer. She was looking at the largest of the scars, a city sprawled across the wide mouth of a river on the northern continent, gray and geometric and enormous. And she was thinking, against every rational thing she knew, that dead things did not usually look so patient. "Mark it," she said at last. "Full survey protocol and Coro." He looked up. "I want the energy sweep run 3 times, by 3 different people, before anyone goes down there." "You think there's something live?" "I think," she said slowly, "that I have never seen a dead world that didn't leak. Even the dead ones leak Coro, heat, decay, residual power, something. The ground remembers being alive for a long time after the body's gone cold." She watched the silent cities turn beneath her. "This one doesn't leak, and that's either because it's been dead longer than anything we've ever found." "Lord!" She didn't finish it. She didn't have the words yet, but the cold at the back of her skull had a shape now, and the shape was this, or because something down there is very, very good at not being noticed. "I want to stop here before they go down and tell you about the empire. You cannot understand the size of the mistake that is coming unless you first understand the size of the thing that is about to make it, and the particular and ancient shape of its certainty." The empire of the concordant throne had eaten 400 worlds. It did not think of this as conquest. Conquest was a word for struggle, and the empire had known very little struggle. Most species, when they finally met it, did the sensible thing. They looked up at the fleets that blotted out their own suns. They looked at the weapons that could crack a continent like an egg and let the yolk of it run into space. They looked at the sheer ancient, unbearable weight of a civilization that had been swallowing stars since before their own kind had learned to bury their dead. And they knelt. They knelt because the arithmetic of kneeling was obvious, and the arithmetic of resistance was a single short line that ended in fire. Those who did not kneel were not conquered either. They were simply removed. The empire did this the way you remove a stain from a garment, without anger, without ceremony, without keeping any particular memory of the stain afterward. It saw no reason to remember the things it erased. Memory was for things that mattered, and a thing that could be erased had proven by the act of being erased that it had never mattered at all. This was the logic at the very heart of the empire, and I want you to hold it, because everything that follows turns on it. The empire believed 2 things absolutely. The first was that it was the strongest force that had ever existed or would ever exist. This was not arrogance exactly in the empire's own mind. It was simply an observed fact. It had met 400 worlds and beaten 400 worlds, and a thing with a record like that does not call its confidence arrogance. It calls it experience. The second belief was subtler, and it was the one that would kill them. The empire believed that age equaled strength. That a thing 4,000 years old was, by simple definition, stronger than a thing 400 years old, and a thing 400 years old stronger than a thing 4. The whole empire was built on this conviction. It ranked every species it met by how long that species had existed, and it had never once been wrong, because the young species it met were always weak, and the weak ones always knelt or burned. And so the pattern confirmed itself again and again across 4,000 years, until it was not a belief anymore but a law, as fixed in the empire's mind as the law that made fire hot. Age was strength, the old beat the young. This was simply how the universe worked. The empire was about to meet a thing that did not get weaker as it aged. A thing that only got more certain. The landing party went down in 6 dropships. 400 souls, because the empire did nothing small and never had, and could not have conceived of a reason to start now. Senna went with them, against her own judgment, which was telling her in a low and constant voice to fold space and run. To mark this system forbidden and let it rot in the deep archives for another 1,000 years. Untouched, unwoken, until the empire was a different thing or no thing at all, and someone wiser could decide what to do with a world that did not leak. But she had no authority to do that. Her authority extended exactly as far as reading the dead and pricing what they had left behind, and a feeling in the base of her skull was not evidence, and the empire did not run on feelings. It ran on extraction. And so down she went, strapped into the belly of a dropship, descending through clean, cold air that no living thing had breathed in a very long time. The city at the river's mouth received them in silence. It was bigger from inside than it had any right to be. The towers stood in gray alloy ranks, taller than anything the empire built for mere living. These were not homes, or not only homes, they were statements, the architecture of a species that had wanted to be remembered and had built accordingly. The streets ran wide enough to march an army down. And over everything lay a fine gray powder that Senna first took for dust, and then understood was not dust at all, but the slow, patient residue of erosion. 10,000 years of wind and water working on works that had been built to last forever, grinding the surface of permanence itself into this thin gray flour that gave underfoot. The builders had wanted to last. You could feel it in every line of the place. You could feel it in the depth of the foundations where they emerged from the broken ground, sunk into bedrock as though their makers had intended not merely to build a city, but to argue with time, to drive their works so deep into the bones of the world that even time would have to work to take them. Time had won, but it had taken its time winning. And that, Senna thought, walking down a street that had not known a footfall in 100 centuries, that told her something. Slow death was one thing, a civilization that withered, that shrank back into a few last cities and then a few last towns and then a few last fires before the dark took it, that left a particular kind of ruin, ragged at the edges, a body that had fought for every year. This was not that. This was whole. The city had not died by inches. The city had been abandoned, fully populated and fully functional, in a single coordinated motion, the way you abandon a ship, not because it is sinking, but because you are going somewhere the ship cannot follow. Whatever they were, she said mostly to herself, they built to outlast their own deaths. Coro was a few steps behind her, his instruments chattering, his light sweeping the walls. He stopped at one and made a small sound, and she turned. "Reader, look at this." It was writing. Not one script but dozens, layered over each other down the height of the wall, generation upon generation of it. Even Senna, who could not read a single character of it, could see the thing that had tightened Coro's voice. It changed. The oldest layers near the bottom were crude, angular, blunt, the heavy, clumsy marks of a young species that had only just discovered that a thought could be made to outlive the mouth that thought it. And then, climbing the wall, the marks grew. They refined. They flowed. By the top of the wall, the script had become something dense and elegant and almost beyond comprehension, a sophistication that made the bottom layers look like the scratchings of animals. And it was the same wall, the same people, the same unbroken line, racing up the wall and up the ladder of complexity at a speed that made the hair rise on Senna's arms. "How long," she said, "from the bottom of that wall to the top, how long did it take them?" Coro ran the numbers. Then he ran them again, because he did not believe them the first time, and Senna watched the color leave his young, hungry face. "If these layers are generational," he said slowly, "and the spacing is regular, reader, they went from stone tools to whatever raised these towers in under 12,000 years." She said nothing. She did the comparison in her own head, the one he was too rattled to say out loud. 12,000 years. The empire had taken 400,000 to cross the same distance. The empire was proud of 400,000. The empire told the story of those 400,000 years as a triumph, the slow, magnificent ascent of the greatest civilization the universe had ever produced. These people had done it 30 times faster, and then they had vanished. She looked up the silent length of the nearest tower, and for the first time she understood dimly what she was standing inside of. Not the grave of a slow and ancient folk who had ripened and faded the way the empire imagined all things faded. The grave of something that had run, something fast, something that had crossed in 12,000 years, a gulf the empire was still crossing, and had not stopped at the towers, she suspected, had not stopped at all, had kept running right off the edge of the wall into a sophistication that left no marks because the marks themselves had become unnecessary. "Where did they go?" she said quietly. "Reader. They didn't die here, Coro. Look at this place. Nobody fought for this city. Nobody starved in it. They walked out of it whole." She turned in a slow circle, taking in the cold and perfect tombs. "So where did they go? Let me tell you, because they could not have known it, where the builders went. Let me tell you what this world was before it went quiet, and why. It had not always been silent. Once it had screamed. For most of its history it was exactly what the wall described. A young, furious, impossibly fast species clawing its way up out of the mud of its own beginnings. They killed each other, and they loved each other, and they built, and they burned what they built, and they built again on the ashes, faster each time, learning each time, and they did all of it loud. They sang into their sky the way all young species sing, carelessly, joyfully, never once thinking about who might be listening. And they were, by every measure the empire would have recognized, weak. They had no fold drives. For most of their history they had barely left their own moon. When the empire's catalogues were already 4,000 years thick, this species was still arguing about the shape of its own continents, still dying of its own diseases, still small enough and slow enough and young enough that the empire, had it noticed them at all, would have filed them as not yet worth the fuel to harvest. A field that had not yet ripened, something to come back for. But they had two things the empire never accounted for, because the empire's law had no place to put them. The first was speed. They learned faster than anything had a right to. A discovery made on one side of their world reached the other side in days, then hours, then in the time it takes to draw breath, until the whole species was thinking very nearly as a single enormous mind, and ideas that should have taken 10,000 years to develop took them 10. The empire, had it been watching, would have mistaken this for the ordinary churn of youth. It was not youth. It was a different kind of mind. The empire stored its strength in age, in accumulation, in the slow piling up of conquered centuries. These creatures stored their strength somewhere the empire had never thought to look. They stored it in acceleration, in the rate of change itself. And a thing whose strength is in its acceleration does not grow weaker as time passes. It grows weaker only when it stops, and these creatures did not stop. The second thing they had was fear. They looked up, one quiet century, at their own loud sky, and they did the arithmetic. They counted the stars, and they counted the silence between the stars, and they understood in the cold, exact, sleepless way that frightened clever things understand, that a universe so large and so old and so very quiet was not quiet because it was empty. It was quiet because something kept making it quiet. They could not have known about the empire. The empire was too far, too uninterested, a predator that had simply not yet turned its head in their direction. But they did not need to know its name. They reasoned that it existed, that something existed, vast and old and patient, that ate the singers, and that this was why the universe was so full of silence and so empty of voices. They reasoned that the silence was not natural. The silence was a result. And they reasoned, finally, the thing that no other young species in the history of the galaxy seems ever to have reasoned, or at least to have acted on. One day it would come for them. And when it came, they would be young, small, slow to arrive at the fight the way the young are always slow, with all their growing still ahead of them and none of it done in time. So they made a decision. It is the strangest decision in this whole story and the most human, and I want you to sit with how strange it is, because the empire never once in 4,000 years was clever enough or frightened enough to make it. The empire, faced with a coming threat, would have built. More fleets, more weapons, more of the same, and met the enemy head-on in the confidence of its accumulated age. That is what strength does. Strength meets the thing. These creatures were not strong. They knew they were not strong. They knew that if the enemy came tomorrow, or in 100 years, or in 1,000, they would lose because they would still be young, and the enemy would be old, and in a straight contest the old beat the young. They understood the Empire's own law better than the Empire did, and they understood that by that law they were already dead. So they decided not to fight by that law. They decided not to be there. It was a soldier named Havoc who found the door, and he was not supposed to find anything at all. He was security. He had been posted to the deep end of a structure the survey teams had tagged as a manufactory, some vast cathedral of dead machines whose function nobody could read, ranks of silent apparatus reaching up into the dark, the corpses of tools built by hands that had understood physics the Empire was still guessing at. Havoc understood none of it and was not paid to. He was paid to stand in the dark with a weapon while the clever people catalogued the bones, and he was bored, and his legs ached, and so he did the thing soldiers have done since the first soldier stood the first watch. He leaned against the wall to rest. The wall was warm. He noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar song, not all at once, but as a slowly arriving certainty that something was not as it should be. Everything else in the dead city was cold. The air was cold and the alloy was cold, and even the light that fell through the broken ceiling seemed cold, a thin gray light with no warmth left in it. But this wall here, in the deepest part of the deepest building on the whole silent world, was warm. Faintly. The way a sleeping animal is warm. The way a chest is warm when you lay your hand on it and feel, beneath the warmth, the slow tide of something alive. Havoc stood up very straight. He put his bare palm flat against the wall, and beneath the warmth he felt it, a vibration, so low it was almost not a sound at all, a hum you felt in the bones of your hand and the roots of your teeth more than you heard, slow and steady and unbearably patient. A thing turning over, very slowly in its sleep. He did not understand what he was touching, but some part of him older than understanding did, the same animal part that had gone cold in Senna's skull up in orbit, and it stood the hair up on his neck and dried the spit in his mouth and made him call, in a voice that came out smaller than he meant it to, for the reader. Senna came. She laid her own bare hand against the wall where his had been, and she felt the warmth, and beneath the warmth the slow hum, and she closed her eyes. In her career she had laid her hands on 1,000 dead walls. She knew the silence of dead things in her palms the way a physician knows a stopped heart. This was not that silence. This was the opposite of that silence. This was the deep, slow patience of a thing that was not dead, had never been dead, had only been waiting, and she understood, standing there with her eyes shut and her hand on the warm wall, that the cold at the back of her skull up in orbit had been exactly right, and that she had brought 400 people down into the mouth of it anyway, because the Empire did not run on feelings. "Koro," she said without opening her eyes, "get me a sounding. I want to know what's behind this wall." It took an hour. When the results came back, Koro's hands were shaking, and he had stopped smiling some time ago, and he would not smile again in the small remainder of his life. "Reader," he said, "it's hollow." "How big a chamber?" "You don't understand. The whole," he stopped, started again, and his voice came out flat, the voice of a man reading numbers he did not want to be true. "The whole continent is hollow, not natural, built. There's a chamber under us, and it's not the only one. There are thousands of them, tens of thousands. They go down 9 kilometers and they spread out under everything, under the cities, under the rivers, under the ocean floors. They run under the whole crust of the world, reader, the entire planet, and they're all connected. Every one of them joined to every other one, a single structure the size of a world's skin." He looked up, and his eyes in the dark were white all the way around. "And they're warm, all of them. The cities are dead, but whatever's underneath them never died at all. It's just been down there, in the dark, warm." Senna kept her hand on the wall a moment longer, feeling the slow turn of the thing inside it, and at last she understood the silence completely, and the understanding was so large and so cold that for a moment she could not speak. The civilization had not died. It had not faded, had not fallen, had not burned itself out in some final war. The cities were empty because their builders had not wanted to be in the cities when the thing they feared finally arrived. They had looked at their loud sky and their short fast lives, and their certain knowledge that an enemy was coming, old and vast, and unbeatable by the young thing they were, and they had understood that they could not win the fight as themselves. So they had stopped being themselves. They had taken everything they were, their speed, their fury, their terrible fast-learning minds, the whole accumulated genius of a species that thought as one, and they had poured all of it down into the bedrock of their own world, into the 9-kilometer dark, into 10,000 chambers wired into a single thing the size of a planet's skin. They had built no. Senna's mind shied from built because built was too small. They had not built a machine. A machine was a tool, a thing apart from its makers, and this was not apart from anything. They had become it. They had emptied themselves into the ground, and the ground had woken up. And then this was the part that closed the cold hand all the way around her heart, and then they had lain down in their perfect cities, every one of them, willingly, and died, so that the thing underneath would have nothing left to protect but its own purpose, so that it could not be reasoned with, because there was no one to reason on its behalf, could not be bargained with, because it wanted nothing the enemy could offer, could not be threatened with the lives of hostages, because it had no hostages, no families, no soft, warm, vulnerable people the enemy could hold a blade to. It had only itself, and its purpose, and 10,000 years of dark in which to sharpen both. What did they build? Havoc whispered. He had not understood most of it, but he had understood the warmth under his hand, and that was enough to make a brave man's voice shake. They didn't build anything, Senna said. They became something, a whole species. They poured themselves into the ground and went to sleep, and they left the cities on top as a marker, as a lid. She took her hand off the wall slowly, the way you take your hand off a sleeping animal you very much do not want to wake. And we just spent 2 days walking around on the lid taking samples. And then this man, she nodded at Havoc, leaned on the door and knocked. The builders had been afraid of waking too early. It was the one flaw they could find in their own terrible plan, and they had labored over it. If the thing they made woke for any small thing, a meteor strike, a quake, a wandering beast on the surface, it would spend its fury on nothing, exhaust itself against an accident, and be empty when the true enemy finally came. A weapon that fires at shadows is no weapon at all. So they built it to sleep deep, and to ignore the small, and to wake for exactly one thing and one thing only. They built it to wake for the touch of another mind. Not their own, it would know its own, would know the signature of the people who had made it the way you know your own hand in the dark, but the touch of a mind that was not theirs, walking on their world, reading their walls, putting its hand against their door that it would wake for. They tuned it for that. They built the trigger after long thought, out of the one thing they were certain the enemy would carry, the one thing the enemy could not leave at home however clever it was. Certainty. Because they knew, in the cold exact way that frightened clever things know, that whatever finally came for them would come sure of itself, would not flee a quiet world, would not see the silence and feel, as Senna had felt, the cold finger laid against the back of the skull, and turn and run. It would walk down into the quiet, certain of its own strength, certain that the dead were dead, certain that a graveyard was a treasure and a silent world was an empty one. It would catalogue them. It would price them. It would put its sure, ancient, arrogant hand against the door. They built the trap to spring on exactly the kind of thing the empire was. And then they lay down and the world went quiet, and the quiet did its slow grinding work on the cities up above, and 10,000 years passed like a single held breath, while 9 kilometers down in the dark, The thing they had become lay still and patient and getting, every silent century, a little more sure. It did not happen all at once. That was the worst of it. There was time, at first, to misunderstand what was happening, and the Empire used every second of that time the way it used everything, badly, and with confidence. The warmth spread. Within an hour of Koro's sounding, the wall Havoc had leaned against was no longer warm but hot, hot enough to feel through a glove, and the hum was no longer a thing felt only in the teeth but a sound now, a real sound, rising out of the deep stone and into the air of the dead city. A vast slow tone, the lowest string of an instrument the size of a world being drawn, very slowly, toward a note. The survey teams felt it in their chests before they heard it in their ears. It got into the body. Some of them, standing in the gray streets with their instruments forgotten in their hands, began without knowing why to weep. Senna ordered the evacuation. Her lasting credit, she ordered it early, while there was still just possibly a chance. She did not wait for evidence the Empire would have accepted. She had her feeling, and she had the hot wall, and she had a continent's worth of warm chambers waking up beneath her feet, and that was enough. "Everyone up," she said into the command channel, and her voice did not shake, whatever her hands were doing. "All teams, all ships, full evacuation immediate. We are leaving this world and we are not coming back. Move." And the Empire did not listen, because the Empire never had. The dropship commander outranked her, a thick-necked, decorated man named Resh who had spent his career on conquered worlds, and had never in his life met a problem that more force did not solve. And Resh had just been told by Orbit that the Threnody of Vale was now reading energy signatures beneath the planet's crust that exceeded the output of a small star, and were climbing, and the Empire did not run from power on that scale. The Empire harvested power on that scale. Power on that scale was the single most valuable thing in the known universe, and a reader's nerves were not going to be the reason it slipped through the Empire's fingers. "Belay that evacuation," Resh said. "Hold position. Command wants samples. Command wants that, whatever it is, that's a strategic tier energy source, and we are not abandoning it because a reader got a chill. You can't sample it." Senna heard her own voice climbing and did not care. "You're not listening. There's nothing to sample. There's no power source down there. It's not a reactor, it's them. It's the whole species. They poured themselves into the ground, and they've been waiting 10,000 years for exactly this. For someone exactly like us to walk down here certain we could take it. Reader Vales, that is enough. And we have given it everything it needs. We told it what we are. We came down here 400 strong and certain, and we put our hands all over its door, and now it's awake. And the only thing it has ever wanted to do, the only purpose it has, the thing it spent 100 centuries getting ready to do, is to us, right now. That is enough." The ground moved. It was not an earthquake. Senna had felt earthquakes. She had read worlds that tore themselves apart, and she knew the feel of a planet settling, the deep relief of released stress, the groan of a thing that wants only to be still. This was the opposite of that. This was the world clenching. Every fault line and plate boundary on the continent flexed at once, in a single coordinated contraction, like a muscle that had lain still so long it had forgotten it was a muscle, and now, all at once, remembered. The dead cities came down. They did not fall. Falling is what tired old structures do, a slow, defeated toppling. These folded, drawn inward and downward in a few seconds, 10,000 years of gray towers pulled back into the ground that had made them, the lid of the box opening from beneath. The river reversed. The very horizon shuddered. The first dropship that tried to lift off did not make it. Senna watched it. She watched it rise off the broken plaza, clawing for altitude, 300 meters, 4, and then simply stop. Held in the air by nothing she could see, no beam, no field, no visible hand. It hung there for one impossible second, engines screaming against a thing that was not there, and then it crumpled. Inward. All at once. as though an enormous invisible fist had closed around it and shut, and the screaming stopped, and the wreckage fell back to the ground that had refused to let it leave. There had been no weapon. That was the thing she could not get past, in the small frozen time she had left to understand anything. There was no flash, no detonation, no discharge of energy. The thing in the ground had not done anything to the dropship. It had not added force or fire or motion. It had simply, locally, quietly, decided that the dropship would not leave, had revised the rules of that small piece of the universe, the way you might cross out a line in a book and write a different one, and the universe, faced with a certainty 10,000 years old, had complied. The dropship had not left because leaving was no longer permitted. That was all. That was everything. And Senna, standing on the trembling ground with the fist closing around the world, understood at last the precise nature of the difference between the Empire's power and this. The Empire's power did things to the universe. It pushed. It burned. It added force to force, the way the young and the strong always do, more energy, more mass, more fire, a power measured in what it could break. It was, in the end, only a very large fist. This did not push. This did not add anything at all. This had spent 10,000 years thinking its way past the entire idea of force, out the far side of it, into something the Empire had no word for because the Empire had never needed one, and what it had become, down there in the dark, was not a bigger fist. It was a thing that could lean very close to the universe and tell it with perfect certainty how things were going to be. And the universe, which had never in all its age met a certainty like that, did as it was told. "Run," Senna said to Havoc, to Koro, to the soldiers frozen around her in the folding city. And they ran, and it did not matter at all. I will tell you now what the Empire did, because it is the most important part of the whole story, and because everyone gets it wrong when they tell it afterward. The Empire did not retreat. This is the thing, this is the whole thing. A wiser power would have run. A more frightened power, a younger power, the kind of power the builders had once been, would have seen that first dropship crumple in the empty air, seen a world fold its own cities back into the ground, felt the fist of an awakened god close around the sky, and folded space and fled, and burned the coordinates, and quarantined the system for 10,000 years of its own, and counted itself unbelievably lucky to have lost only 6 dropships and 400 souls. But the Empire was 4,000 years old. The Empire had eaten 400 worlds. The Empire had never, in all that vast accumulated history, lost, and a thing that has never lost does not know how. It does not have the reflex. It has never needed to grow the muscle that turns and runs, and so when the impossible finally came for it, it had only one response in its whole ancient repertoire, the single response that had carried it across 4,000 years and 400 worlds and had never once failed. More. Up in orbit, Resh's superiors did the only arithmetic the Empire knew how to do, a strategic tier energy source, a planetary anomaly that had destroyed an entire landing operation, an unknown hostile power of unprecedented scale. The answer to all of it, the answer to everything, was the same answer it had always been. They brought the fleet down. 11,000 vessels, the weapons that had cracked continents and let the yoke run into space. The accumulated, perfected, 4,000-year-old might of 400 conquered worlds, every gun and every hull and every certainty of it, descending through the atmosphere of one quiet planet in a wall of fire that turned the night side to day. Senna, on the ground, looked up and saw the sky fill with the full and furious strength of the greatest civilization the universe had ever produced, and for one moment, I want to be honest about this, because she was, for one moment even she believed it might be enough. That 4,000 years and 400 worlds, and the whole weight of all that age might be enough, by sheer mass, to crush the young thing in the ground before it fully woke. It was not a fight. I want to be precise about this, because afterward the Empire would call it the Battle of the Quiet World, and it was not a battle. A battle is a thing that happens between two powers, either of which might win. This was not that. There was never a moment in which the empire might have won. There was only the moment in which it had not yet understood that it had already lost. The thing in the bedrock had spent 10,000 years getting ready, and it had not spent that time building weapons. That was the mistake the empire could not have caught, because it was a mistake built into the empire's own law. The empire assumed that a power preparing for war builds weapons, because that is what the empire would have done, because weapons are what the young and the strong build, bigger fists for the breaking of bigger things. But the builders had not been strong. They had been fast, and a fast thing given 10,000 years of uninterrupted dark does not build a bigger fist. It does something the empire had no concept of, no defense against, no word for. It gets smarter. It runs its terrible accelerating mind, alone in the dark, with nothing to do and nothing to interrupt it, century after century after century, refining and sharpening and accelerating, thinking its way past every weapon the universe can hold and out the other side, until the gap between it and a 4,000-year-old empire is not the gap between a small fleet and a large one, but the gap between an empire and an insect. The empire had aged 10,000 years too, in that span. But the empire had aged the way stone ages. The thing in the ground had aged the way fire spreads. It did not destroy the fleet. Destruction was crude. Destruction was a thing you did with force, and it was so far past force now that force was a children's toy it had set down 100 centuries ago. It reached up into the sky, into the descending wall of 11,000 ships, and it understood them. Every vessel and every weapon and every certainty that held them together, it understood all of it, more completely and more quickly than the fleet understood itself, the way you understand a sentence in a language you have spoken all your life. And having understood the fleet completely, it disagreed with it. That is the only way Senna could ever describe what she saw, and she described it badly, and knew she described it badly, and never found better words for the rest of her life. The fleet did not explode. It did not burn. There was no flash, no shockwave, no debris. The fleet simply stopped being. 11,000 vessels and the perfected might of 400 worlds, unmade not by a weapon, but by a mind that had decided, with 10,000 years of certainty stacked behind the decision, that they would not continue, and the universe, faced with a certainty that old and that complete, did the only thing the universe ever does in the presence of a certainty like that. It agreed. The sky, which a moment before had been full of the fire of an empire, was empty, quiet. The night side went dark again. The stars came back out, indifferent and silent, the way they had been for 10,000 years and would be for 10,000 more. And then the thing in the bedrock turned its attention, for the first time, downward to the small scatter of warm living minds still running across its surface. To Senna and Havoc and Koro, and the handful of survey crew who had not made it to the dropships and so, by the accident of being too slow to die in the sky, were still alive on the ground. It looked at them. I cannot tell you what it is to be looked at by a thing that has spent 10,000 years learning how to look. Senna tried, afterward more than once, to people who needed to know and to people who only wanted the story, and she could never make it land. The closest she ever came was this. She said it was like being read. She said that she had spent her whole life as a reader, walking into the graves of dead civilizations and reading them, the crude bottom layers and the elegant top ones, peeling them open and pricing them and carrying them away in pieces, and that in that moment all of it turned around at once. Every wall she had ever read, every grave she had ever opened, all of it spun around and pointed back at her, and she was the wall now, and the thing in the ground read her the way she had read 1,000 dead worlds, from the first crude layer of her to the last, all the way down completely, in less time than it takes to understand that you are being looked at. It read the empire in her. That was the thing she felt most clearly. It did not read Senna Valles, the woman, the reader, the one who had ordered the evacuation early and been overruled. It read, through her, the empire, 4,000 years of certainty, 400 swallowed worlds, the long unbroken arrogance that had sent the threnody of Vale across the dark to a quiet system to harvest the dead. It read the law that age was strength. It read every world the empire had erased and not bothered to remember. It read all of it, in her, in an instant, the way she had read so many. And then, and this is the part everyone gets wrong, every single time the story is told, it did not kill her. The builders had been afraid of one last thing at the very end. Not of dying, they had chosen that with open eyes. They had been afraid of what their own child would become. They had reasoned it through in their last frightened clever century, the way they reasoned through everything. They were about to make a mind, and sharpen it alone in the dark for 10,000 years with nothing to think about but an enemy and the killing of an enemy. And they understood the risk in that. They understood that a mind shaped by nothing but the contemplation of an enemy might, when it finally woke, be nothing but that enemy, as certain, as cold, as hungry, as arrogant. That it might win the war against the empire by the simple expedient of becoming the empire. That the universe would lose its tyrant and gain only a newer one, with a different name and the same appetite, and that everything they had poured themselves into the ground to prevent would happen anyway, wearing their own face. So they built one last thing into it, not a weapon. They had no shortage of those. They built in a question. They built the thing in the bedrock so that, in the moment of its waking, in the instant after it had unmade whatever had come to harvest them, it would be made to ask itself the only question that had ever mattered to the people who made it. Now that I am stronger than the thing I feared, will I become it? The thing in the bedrock asked itself that question in the silent instant after 11,000 ships stopped being. And it answered. It let Senna live. It let Havoc and Quarro and the handful of survivors live. It gathered them up not gently. There was no gentleness anywhere in it, but deliberately with the unhurried care of a thing that has already won and has nothing left to fear. And it set them down whole and breathing at the edge of the ruined city, on ground that had stopped trembling, under a sky that had gone quiet again. And it spoke to them. The only time it ever spoke. Not in sound, it was 100 centuries past sound, but in meaning, arriving whole and finished in their minds the way certainty arrives, the way the answer to a problem you have been chewing for hours suddenly simply is there, complete. It said, go back. It said, tell them what waits here. Tell them the quiet worlds are not empty. Tell them the universe is silent not because nothing lives in it, but because the things that live in it learned, a long time ago, what comes for the loud and chose, instead of singing, to go down into the dark and wait and get ready. It said, we were young once. We were small and afraid, and we looked up at the silence and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic frightened us into wisdom. You never did the arithmetic. You looked at the silence and called it emptiness. You looked at the dead and called them treasure. You counted your 400 worlds and called the counting strength. You mistook age for power and certainty for safety, and you walked down into a graveyard sure it was a prize, and the graveyard was a door, and you knocked. And here I am. And then it told them the thing that ended the empire, though the empire, true to itself, would take 3 more centuries to finish dying. It said, there are more of us than you have ever bothered to imagine. We are under more worlds than you have catalogued. We have been waiting longer than your empire has existed, in the dark, getting ready, and we do not grow weaker as we wait. We grow more certain. Every one of the quiet worlds you passed over because it did not sing, every silent stone you marked as empty and did not bother to harvest, ask yourselves now what was underneath it. Ask yourselves how many doors you have already walked across. And then, and here, Senna said, the meaning in her mind had carried something almost like the memory of warmth, almost like the ghost of the people who had made the thing. The last echo of the species that had poured itself into the ground so that this could exist. And then tell them the children of the slow worlds are awake now, and tell them we remember who came knocking. Senevales flew home in the only dropship, the thing in the bedrock allowed to leave. There were 40 of them aboard, out of 400. The ship rose unmolested into a sky that an hour before had eaten an Empire's fleet, and folded space at the edge of the system, and not one of the 40 looked back at the quiet blue world turning behind them. They did not speak for the entire journey home. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say better, and most of them had learned, in a single afternoon, a new and permanent respect for silence. She delivered the message. Of course she did. That was what she had been let live to do, and the thing in the ground had read her completely enough to know she would do it, had known, reading her all the way down, that whatever else Senevales was, she was a person who told the truth about what she had seen, because that was the whole of what a reader was. It had chosen its messenger as carefully as it had chosen everything else. She stood before the concordant throne. She stood before 4,000 years of certainty, in the great hall at the heart of an empire that had never lost, and she told it that it had finally met a thing older than itself, not older in years, but older in fear, which is a thing the powerful forget the instant they become powerful, and the frightened never, ever forget. She told them about the quiet worlds. She told them to stop counting their conquests and start counting the silence. She told them about the door, and the knock, and the 11,000 ships that had simply stopped being, and the species that had buried itself alive to win a war it could not survive. They did not believe her. Of course they did not. How could they? The empire had never lost, and a thing that has never lost cannot truly conceive that the thing which beat it was real. It is so much easier, so much more in keeping with 4,000 years of law, to believe that the witness is broken, that the reader is unwell, that the loss of 11,000 ships was some freak of cosmic weather, an anomaly, a thing to be studied and filed and not feared. They heard her out. They were not unkind about it, and they thanked her for her long service, and they quietly relieved her of her post, the way you quietly relieve anyone who has come back from the dark saying things the powerful would rather not hear. And then they sent another fleet. To be sure, to recover what could be recovered. To prove, with more force, that the first loss had been an accident, because the alternative, that force itself, had stopped working, that the oldest law of the empire had a counterexample sleeping under a quiet world, was a thing the empire could not afford to be true, and so could not afford to believe. That fleet did not come back. So they sent another, larger, and that one did not come back, and somewhere in the loss of the third fleet, very slowly, with the grinding reluctance of a thing 4,000 years old turning to look at its own death, the empire began at last to do the arithmetic, the same arithmetic the builders had done in a single frightened century, the arithmetic of the silence. Except the empire did it the way the empire did everything. Too slowly, too late. Fleet by lost fleet, world by quiet world. Because the thing under the blue world had told the simple truth. There were more of them. There were so many more of them. All across the territory the empire had spent 4,000 years mapping, there were worlds that did not sing. Silent stones. Quiet gardens. Worlds the empire had passed over precisely because they were quiet, marked as empty, as not yet ripe, as beneath the fuel it would cost to harvest them, and under how many of them now did something stir? How many doors had the empire's surveyors walked across in 4,000 years of cataloguing the dead, putting their certain hands on warm walls and feeling nothing because they were not readers, not afraid, not listening? How many of the silent worlds were graves, and how many of the graves were lids, and how many of the lids had a fast and furious and unbearably patient thing sleeping underneath, waiting only for the touch of a certain hand? The empire would spend 3 centuries finding out. One quiet world at a time, the graveyards it had ignored for 4,000 years opened from below. The empire met them the only way it knew how, with more, with force, with fleets and fire and the law that age was strength. And the quiet worlds disagreed with the fleets, one after another. the way the first had without a flash or a sound, and the empire grew smaller and smaller, and the silence it had passed over for 4,000 years rose up around it from underneath, patient and certain and very, very old. It was not conquered. I want to be exact about this because it matters. The empire of the concordant throne was not conquered, and it was not destroyed, not in any way it would have recognized as defeat. There was no final battle, no enemy fleet at the gates, no surrender. There was only the slow accumulating discovery, world by world and century by century, that the universe had never been empty, that it had only been waiting, and that everything the empire had believed about strength had been, all along, exactly backward. The empire simply met, one quiet planet at a time, the things that had been getting ready longer than it had existed. And it learned, far too late, the lesson the builders had carved into their own bedrock and their own willing graves. Strength is not how long you have won. Strength is how long you were willing to wait. Senevalis lived a long time, for one of her kind. She spent the rest of it on a small world at the very edge of everything, a quiet world, though not so quiet as the blue one, and she spent it doing the only thing that still made any sense to her after what she had seen. She read the sky. She had spent her whole career believing that silence meant emptiness, that a quiet world was a dead one, a thing to be opened and priced and carried away in pieces. She knew better now, and the knowing had cost her everything she had once thought her life was for. So she sat under the sky at the edge of everything, in the years they gave her after they took her post, and she counted the silent worlds, the ones that did not broadcast, the ones that did not leak, the ones that did not sing. There were so many of them. She had never noticed before how many there were. When you stop assuming silence is emptiness, when you start hearing silence as patience, the night sky becomes a different thing entirely, not a scattering of empty stones around a few singing worlds, but a vast dark field of held breath, world after quiet world after quiet world, each one waiting in its own deep dark to see what the loud things would finally become. She understood them now. That was the thing she had brought back from the blue world, the only thing worth keeping. The loudest thing in the universe is a young species that has not yet learned to be afraid, singing into the dark, careless and joyful, sure of its own importance, certain the silence is empty because it cannot imagine anyone choosing to be silent. And the most dangerous thing in the universe is an old one that has been afraid for 10,000 years and has used every hour of the fear to get ready. The silence was not death. She had been so wrong about that for so long, and so had the empire, and the empire had died of the wrongness while she watched. The silence was patience. The silence was the whole universe, holding its breath in the dark, waiting to see what the loud ones would do and getting ready, every quiet century, every silent world for the answer. She died, finally, an old woman under an open sky, looking up at a field of silent stars that she was no longer afraid of, because she understood them now, and you cannot be afraid of a thing you truly understand. The empire that had relieved her of her post was, by then, 3/4 gone and shrinking, and would in another generation be only one more silence among the others, one more quiet world among all the quiet worlds, its singing finished, its certainty spent, joining at last the long, dark, patient majority it had spent 4,000 years passing over. She was not afraid. She understood. And somewhere out in all that patient dark, under a blue world that did not sing, the thing the builders had become lay still again, and warm and certain, having done the single thing it was made for, having asked itself the only question that mattered, and answered it, and let the messenger go and went back down into the long dark to wait, the way it had waited before, the way the quiet worlds had always waited, for whatever loud and certain thing came knocking next. The empire of the concordant throne fell in the 312th year after the quiet world. It was not conquered, it was not destroyed. It simply met, one quiet planet at a time, the things that had been waiting longer than it had existed, and learned, far too late, the lesson the builders had carved into their bedrock and their graves, the lesson the silence had been keeping all along, in the dark, getting ready, for anyone arrogant enough to come and dig it up. Strength is not how long you have won. Strength is how long you are willing to wait.